Well, hello, everybody. I would like to personally welcome all of you to the July Oregon City Business Alliance Forum. We've got a little different program for you today. As you can see, we have our distinguished panel over here to the left, your right, each with a particular background. They're going to be going ahead and sharing a little bit of information about where their particular portion of the industry fits into this big topic of housing and transportation and the dynamics. So with that being said, William, it's all yours.
I wanted to let you know that we are, there are some things that we are not focusing on today. We are not focusing on the houselessness issue or the homeless issue right now. We're not talking about environmental impacts of growth, and there are plenty. We're not talking about the service impacts of growth, such as required additional retail, churches, entertainment, things like that. We're also not talking about the infrastructure, although Kent alluded to it. We weren't planning on getting into the issue of transportation, which is a significant aspect of it, of course, but the other pieces of infrastructure, such as parking, water, sewer, parks, it sounds like a list of SDCs, but if you understand what SDCs are, and I think this audience does. So those are things that we're not going to be talking about. Transportation we'll be touching on also in phase 2. This is part 1 of our growth story. Part 1 is going to be on housing. Part 2 is going to be on employment and business. Well, I also wanted to clear up why we only have 6 panelists, which is a lot. We do not have any electeds on the panel. We have some electeds here today, Mayor Holliday, Commissioner Ide, and somebody's pointing at somebody, but former Mayor Doug Neely. Paul Savas had signed up. Oh yeah, and former Mayor Fowler. Yeah, oh yeah. We also don't have any banking or financial institutions represented here, and that's an important aspect of growth because you can't do it if you can't finance it. We don't have the county represented here, although we understand that our growth impacts the county. And we don't have the community college represented on our panel, and that's an important aspect of it. And other districts such as Water and Environmental Services, Wes, who is represented here, the library, other districts, excluding the school district, of course, which is one of the most mentioned aspects that we have found having to do with growth. And we also are not inviting first responders. The fire district and the police department are severely impacted by growth, and that's another issue for another day. What started this whole idea for this presentation was a little chart that John Lewis presented as part of a presentation that he was making to the CIC, the Citizen Involvement Committee. And just focus on the pink there, not the green. You can't quite read all of that over there, but the small, medium, and large circles in pink. The small one is projecting growth of less than 500 households. The medium one is 500 to 1,000 households. The large is an increase of over 1,000 households. Now this was out of the Transportation System Plan from 2010 to 2035. Obviously that's already 8 years old. The graphic was, in John's notes, he pointed out, the graphic was developed by DKS and Associates. And the next update for this is likely to occur, he projects, in 2022 or 23. I don't know if you can see the little numbers next to the dots, but those are what the region uses as transportation area zones, which I'm sure Tim knows all about. And this is a planning overlay, but it's a standard overlay. The tan lines represent the boundaries of the zones. So the region tries to project where growth is happening in those zones. But it didn't answer the question that I had about density. So I was concerned, is Oregon City becoming more or less dense? And to that end, I went to our trusty folks at IT at the city and asked our IT director, and he said, Chris Dunlop, our GIS guy, had just created a new app that shows growth of the city for the last 50 years. I suspect not a lot of you have seen this. When you look at it online, there's a little slider bar at the bottom that you can go through year by year. I'm choosing just to do it by 10-year gaps. Oh, I should point this way. I hope some people are amazed. So this was 1968. Our city limits are in the yellow there. The pink indicates the UGB. 1978, 1988, 1998, 2008, and 2018. This does not include the annexations that have yet to happen this year. But I think it's a pretty graphic presentation, and that's available on the city's website. Chris gave me some other comments. He says the data started in 1968. That's when the State Boundary Commission started processing annexations. I'm not sure what happened before then. I assume we have historical records in the form of commission minutes, et cetera, but they're not centralized. It would take quite a bit of work to track them down. And then he also enclosed a spreadsheet showing the actual increases by acre. Then I asked our good friend Lynn Wallace if she would get us some population data, and she did. And she suggested that we present this by square miles, but not a lot of people talk about annexations in square miles. So I kept it to acres because the proportions are the same. When I plotted the growth from this chart, from their data, to the population for those 50 years, I think this is the first time that any of you have ever seen this comparison. So the blue line of acreage has been climbing since 1968, and the population in orange has also been climbing. The greater the delta, the differentiation between these two lines is less density. The closer they are, the more dense we become. So I think the answer is yes, we are becoming more dense. If we want less density, then the area would have to change. In all discussions about growth, it's a pretty contentious issue. There is one continuous, pretty incontrovertible aspect, and that is the aspect of time. Time happens, except for a few egghead philosophers. It's a reality, and we have to deal with it. What time does is it causes change. As a matter of fact, you can only measure time through change. So because time affects change, what happens to change? Change creates disruption. You can call it positive or negative, but it's disruption. Things are different. Why? Because they changed. The question is, what do you do with that disruption? And your options are either death, of course, or adaptation. And so with that as a framework, I'd like to pass this off to our first speaker, who is the Chief Demographer? Well, a numbers guy from Portland State who will tell you all about what he's doing. Charles? And that's the next slide, please.
Thank you. I am a demographer. We don't actually have a title of chief, but we have a number of panelists here who are going to talk about Oregon City specifically, I think, in some cases. So I'm focusing a little more generally, and I hope this is good. Okay. Focus a little more generally on what our office does, who we are, and then a few highlights about growth, Oregon statewide. So we are at Portland State University, and we've been around since before Portland State was a university. We've been doing Well, we're now, and for many years, have been in the College of Urban and Public Affairs at Portland State. We have a number of core functions, and the one that we've been doing the longest is annual population estimates. So every November 15th, we publish our preliminary estimate for July 1st of that year. The current estimates for July 1st, 2017 for every city and county in Oregon. And a number of agencies use these numbers to distribute tax revenues proportionally by population. We have a relatively new program called the Oregon Population Forecast Program to support land use planning around the state. So for all of the counties and urban growth boundary areas outside of Metro's jurisdiction, which you'll hear about next, we do a long-range population forecast. And this is what cities will need if they want to go to the state to apply for a urban growth boundary expansion. They'll need a population forecast in combination with a housing needs analysis and to determine whether they have 20 years of housing capacity. And then thing that I do, State Data Center Program. This is something that we've done since the 80s, and it's local expertise. It's a national network of, in every state, there's somebody like me and a whole network of others within each state actually that know something about their local area as well as knowing something about census data. And we put on events. Next slide has my, or a future slide has my email address. So if you want to be on the list to know about the data users conference that we're having in September, one day in Salem and one day in Portland, email me and I'll include you on the list. We also do custom demographic studies, and first and foremost among stuff I do is enrollment forecasts for K-12 school districts, including Oregon City, and other special districts like water districts, etc. These districts contract with us to do these studies. And we teach some courses in a graduate certificate in applied social demography. We are partnered with the Institute of Portland Metropolitan Studies, and on each of your tables there's a copy of Metroscape, which IMS puts out. There's more copies on the table if you want to pick one up on the way out, and this will give you an idea about what IMS does. And about me, there's that link up there, census.gov/SDC. There's a network nationally of local data experts. So if you need to know something about data in another state, go to this site, census.gov/SDC, and you'll find a list of local experts. Again, I do the K-12 forecasts, and you can reach me at reinerson@pdx.edu, or that phone number. Public service is part of what I do. Just a couple of highlights of statewide growth. You see we've been growing due to people moving here, more people moving in and out. That's the orange bars annually. However, the number of births minus deaths, the green bars, is declining. We're headed toward zero natural increase, more deaths than births probably within 10 years statewide. Most of that growth is in the Portland metro area. And however, big declines in fertility rates. And the blue is non-Latino women total fertility rate. And the green, the biggest drop has been for Latino women in Oregon. We're getting more diverse, mostly due to age distribution. The white non-Latino population is much older than the non-white population. And finally, I hope this sets up some of the other discussions here. We've added over 1 million households from 1960 to 2010 in Oregon, but almost no change in the number of households married with children under 18. The growth has been in people living alone and in families without children, often empty nesters, etc. Thank you.
This one. Okay. Good afternoon. Thank you for having me here. Tim O'Brien, Metro Planning Department. Obviously, I'm here to talk about growth, but which is mostly land use, and touch on transportation, which will be a later forum for you. Also, just wanted to touch briefly on what else Metro does do. We do run the zoo, the convention center, the expo center, the performance centers downtown. We run the transfer station, Metro South here in Oregon City. We move the garbage out of the region to the landfill in Arlington. We have a regional park system, about 17,000 acres, both in and outside the UGB. And we also take care of 19 cemeteries that we inherited from Multnomah County, which is kind of an interesting part of that. On the growth part, though, Metro has two main programs related to growth from the land use side. And this map, there's one on your table, and there was some out front as well. This is the 2040 plan, which is considered the blueprint for growth in the region. This was adopted in 1995, so it's well over 20 years ago, and has been revised slightly over time. There are a total of 40 centers identified. There's 8 regional centers, Oregon City being one of them, downtown Oregon City. There's 32 town centers, and then there's also, downtown Portland is considered the central city for the region. There's also 300 miles of corridors, and I'm not, these yellow lines that are on there, the map, those are the corridors that were identified. And mainly those were the main transit lines at the time in 1995 when this was developed. And then also on the map, you can see, if I can kind of picture out the urban growth boundary, and then the brown areas are the urban reserve areas, which I'll get to in a second. As I mentioned, the centers and corridors are kind of the main theme for the 2040 growth concept. The idea is that that's where we would accommodate most of the growth in the region in the future. So it would be in those downtown areas and along, for instance, McLaughlin is considered a corridor area. The local governments, like Oregon City, have control over the zoning, economic development, permitting of projects, and other functions that help regulate growth in those areas. Metro does not. So this is where Oregon City's local plans really come into play in terms of the vision for the downtown and the city in general. A couple of the main themes for the 2040 growth concept have to do with a multimodal transportation system, green spaces, protection of natural resources, as well as maintaining employment areas and freight areas in the region. The second one is probably get known a little bit more about is the urban growth boundary. This is the other main kind of function in land use wise. Metro maintains the urban growth boundary for the region. As you know, this is the line that separates urban land from rural land. Urban services such as sanitary sewer or urban level streets are not allowed outside of the urban growth boundary under state law. Metro must maintain a 20-year supply of residential land inside the urban growth boundary. And we're also required to evaluate whether we have that 20-year supply every 6 years. And we're doing that currently right now, and we will be making a growth management decision in December of this year. When we expand the urban growth boundary, we have to follow state law. This is the hierarchy of land in state law that we must follow. So we first have to look at the urban reserve areas. And then if we couldn't meet what need we had in the urban reserve areas, we would have to go to what's called non-resource lands. That's land that's rural residential zone, so RFF5 or something like that. And then rural residential farm forest, 5 acres. And then also, finally, we would go to the resource lands, which is your like EFU land or your timber zone land. This is the map of the urban and rural reserves in the region currently. Again, the urban reserves are the blue areas. The green area is the rural reserves. There's about 23,000 acres of urban reserve, and I have to move very quickly here, I just found out. So that's where the 20-year supply would come through for the next 40 years. Rural reserves are green. The green areas can't be brought into the UGB for 50 years. What we first need to do when we're going to expand the UGB, we determine if we have capacity to meet that 20-year supply in the region. Then we do a buildable land analysis to see how much capacity we do have and look at the forecast that we've done to see if we have to expand the UGB. I'm not going to go through these. These are state factors, but just let you know these are requirements that we have to follow in state law, like any other city has to do. So Canby, Malala would have to do this as well. We also have some metro factors that are required that we have to look at. And key point to bring out, these are factors. So this means that we have to address them, but not each urban reserve area would have to meet them. So you have to address them. And then finally, this is a really big one. We have now requiring what we call concept plans before we expand the urban growth boundaries. So the idea here is the local city is going to look at the area, determine how they could provide infrastructure, how they're going to pay for it, annexation issues, those type of things. If someone does not have a concept plan done, the policy right now is we would not expand in that area. So it's really driven by the local government's plans for that. And then finally, real quickly, this is a very cool little part on our website. It's a bunch of stories and statistics about how we're growing in the region. And I've got the red flag.
Is this on? Yes. Excuse me, and I should have been introducing these speakers as we went along. Charles Reinerson with Portland State, and Tim O'Brien, as you understand, from Metro. Wes Rogers is the Director of Operations for the Oregon City School District. And I want to remind everyone also that if you have questions, and I sure hope you do because we've got time scheduled afterwards, please write them down, raise your card over there, as Larry has, and someone will come around and pick them up. Thank you very much. Wes?
Thank you, William. Glad to be here today with you. Just real quickly, we get asked this question quite frequently, is what's happened with school district enrollment, and I'll address some of the factors behind this graph. But if you see in there, the first 10 years from 2007 to 8, we've been declining early in that 10-year period, and then have kind of hung around the 7,400 to 7,500 mark in students. And then projected going forward, because of several factors I'll discuss real quickly, it appears that all three of our models, both low, medium, and high, show growth in the next 10 years. That's good for us because it's healthier for a school district to be growing rather than shrinking or staying the same. And so let me share a little bit about what's going on. A lot of people think we should have been growing the last 10 years. And why haven't we? Well, some statistics from our annual report from Portland State is during 2000 and 2010, during that time, total population in Oregon City School District, which remember is the outlying area of Oregon City, as well as some areas over in the Jennings Lodge, Candy Lane areas, the population grew by 14%, but school-age population only grew by 7%. And that since 2010, school-age population has declined while population has grown. And you could see that a little bit in one of Charles' graphs about households married with children. And in fact, between 2000 and 2010, population under age 5 decreased by 8.5%. And that's a big predictor for us for future enrollment because that predicts our kindergarten classes coming in. And once we have a student, we pretty much keep them, almost all of them, until they graduate from high school. So that's a real big predictor for us going forward and explains kind of what was happening in the previous decade. And there's a lot more educational choices now as well. So students and families have lots of places to go for their education needs. I would point out real briefly, currently one of the reasons we're looking at growing is one, we've got a very large kindergarten class this year. So we're seeing the birth rate tick back up in here locally in our district, and that should predict some larger classes going through our system. And we've had a positive in-migration impact. Not as positive as some people would think, but we do get a slight positive bump in enrollment when we have people moving into the city. I would share just a couple of anecdotal stories. One is, those of you who live here in town know that up by Holcomb Elementary, up on Holcomb Boulevard, there's a new development built in the last 3 or 4 years, had about 30 homes in it. And I got several calls from people saying, what are you going to do at Holcomb Elementary to handle all that expansion? And are you going to hire more teachers? Are you going to build on the school? And I said, well, we're going to wait and see. And we received, the first 6 months, we got 1 student at Holcomb Elementary from that development. And I think we've gotten another one since then. Now, that doesn't account for junior high or high school, but for immediate impact in a young family, there's not a lot of in-migration in Oregon City that we see as far as young families moving in. And my last story would be just here locally, the local superintendents of all the Clackamas County school districts get together quite regularly. And this last year, they noticed a trend, and that was that North Clackamas School District and Gladstone School District and Oregon City School District all lost enrollment slightly or more than slightly, and also saw their free and reduced lunch meal application rates go down. And what that means is that families are moving outside of those districts, and Estacada and Malala and Canby all did the reverse of both of those data points. So we think we're seeing a trend, at least from our organizational standpoint, that we're seeing families moving out to the farther reaches of the county, which concern us because we really believe in a diverse community, and we'd love to see a lot of families move into Oregon City. That kind of gives you a snapshot of what's happening in Oregon City School District.
Thank you, Wes. Good timing. And excuse me, just a little work issue. Sherry, are we going to be picking up the questions later, or I don't mean to interrupt your lunch, but so if you have them, please get those up again. And then our next speaker is going to be Christine Robinson Gardner, who many of you know is a senior planner for the City of Oregon City. Christina.
Thank you. So the Oregon City Planning Department, we work with the community together to determine what is acceptable for, to understand how we want to grow. We look at not only equity, sustainable traffic infrastructure lens, but how we meet and comply with our state land use goals, as well as our regional requirements, such as urban growth boundary. But as you all know, we can plan for growth, but it is really the market that determines when growth happens. We use the adopted code to evaluate if there is sufficient infrastructure to serve any proposed new development and to maintain our existing services, as well as how it meets our community adopted standards. Oregon City Planning Division, we are down to the level of the city, so we can take a look at what Charles is doing at PSU and look at trends, but we cannot predict where growth will happen in Oregon City and how big it will be. So we are also, our lens is really when growth happens, are we prepared for it, and if we plan for enough infrastructure to serve. So in regards to the market, I have two slides to show you. Talk a little bit about how the market has perceived development in the last 10 years. This is the number of planning pre-application conferences, and you can definitely tell where the recession hit and where we are today. So where we are is very much kind of what we were seeing in 2000, 2007, 2008. People are really interested in learning more about development in Oregon City. That is both commercial and residential. So we are in July, and we've had 28 pre-application conferences and more, so we'll probably be pretty even with where we were last year. In regards to the number of dwelling units each year, what you see in the pink are single-family residential units, and multifamily is what you see in the green. And the large 222 units was for the Cove development. So this is dwelling units issued, not completed. But you can kind of see where we stand. Unlike many of our other growing cities, Oregon City, our general subdivision application may be 30 units to 60 units. We often have a lot of 4 and 5 unit subdivision applications. We do not see the 200, 300, 400 unit subdivision applications that people in Hillsborough or Beaverton may have. Our property lots are much less in size, and so if people want to do a larger subdivision, they really have to consolidate multiple lots. And as you know, that's not an easy task. Oregon City Planning looks at development review through many different lenses, and really the inverted triangle is just that. As applications come in for annexation, zone change, and master plan, we're looking at big picture. Is there enough adequate infrastructure to serve? And infrastructure also relates to transportation. And then when the applicant comes into the actually development application, be it subdivision or site plan, we have more information, we can do more refined reviews. We get down into the overlay information and then the building permit. So we start a lot with the applicant, and as we go through the development process, we're able to have a finer tooth review on that infrastructure question. As I mentioned, there are quite a lot of challenges in Oregon City for growing. A lot of it is lot consolidation. Oftentimes the infrastructure is not where you are. You may be 500 feet away from the nearest sewer, and your 4 neighbors ahead of you don't really want to choose to develop. So just being able to coordinate that on a private side is quite difficult. But once again, we are neither pro-development or anti-development in Oregon City planning. We really are looking at, can the area grow when the market is ready? I wanted to give 2 updates on planning projects that are happening right now related to growth. One is equitable housing code amendments. Pete Walters, a planner with the City of Oregon City, has been working this last year with an advisory group looking at how we could add more of the missing middle housing to kind of our existing development area. And there are planning commission and city commission meetings happening this fall. And I do encourage you, if this is something you're interested in. And finally, the Beaver Creek Concept Plan area, we are looking at implementing zoning this next year. We're just finalizing our grant with the state. And if you're interested in that, please come find me at the end of the meeting.
Thank you very much, Christina. And there was an outstanding open house last night regarding the code revisions and particular emphasis on housing. Probably should have been better attended, but we got some comments, and there are going to be other opportunities at City Commission, so please stay in touch regarding those code changes as well. Our next speaker is Gordon Root, who's principal and founder of Stafford Land Company. All of the planning in the world doesn't happen if you don't have a place to put people, and Gordon's the guy that can talk to us about what goes through planning of a development project. Gordon?
Good afternoon. So what I want to talk about is, what's really driving suburban expansion, and it's very interesting to note, the grade school ages. I found that very intriguing as to where they're moving, etc. So, it's really the Portland Urban Growth Boundary, and this is a more expanded version than that Tim had. And I always say there's 2 things that people hate about development, and that's density and suburban sprawl, right? So which is it we're going to have? So one of the things that we really fell into was the land trap inside the Portland metro area, of course, which is all of this area in here, has really caused a huge amount of price increase and many developers tripping over each other to try and buy land for between $400,000 and $700,000 an acre. So what we've really done is we've pushed out into the suburbs, and we'll start over here in Sandy, Estacada, Molalla. We go to Canby, which is one of our big markets. Woodburn, a very good market for us. Dallas, McMinnville. We go over up here into Scappoose, and we're trying to get a deal off the ground in Tualatin, and have been for 14 years, because it's part of the development concept planning. So, the entire Senate Bill 100, which established urban growth boundaries for every city, and as Tim alluded to, that even outside in these areas, in all these small rural markets that we're dealing with around the peripheral, they all have their own urban growth boundaries, and it's kind of hard to see on there, but they have mandated minimum density standards, and that's, everyone thinks it's us, the greedy developer that comes in and puts 6.8 to 10 units an acre in, but it's part of the affordability, balance, and choice of housing. You have to have multiple different housing types inside of each product or inside each community to keep it vibrant and keep people being able to afford it. But as people are getting pushed out further and further, and I know it's not really the transportation, but this ring of rural reserves. So if you look at the urban reserves, they gave us 11% more land to build to accommodate 100% more people. right? So that's what's really pushing people out into these small markets. But it creates a transportation problem because everyone that lives out here and works in here has to go back and forth, back and forth, back and forth every day. And that also, hopefully, is why we have industrial land supply in some of these smaller communities. But the concept planning, so everyone has an urban growth boundary. You have to go through the process to expand your UGB. And then in the Portland metro area, you have to go through a concept plan. This is an absolute, I think, breakdown of our system. We've seen that here in Oregon City and what the impact has been. The Home Builders Association taxed ourselves, fund concept planning, the money gets awarded to various jurisdictions, and it becomes an area where the anti-growth contingent shows up in a big way and just resists. And while I guess there's good that comes out of it, inside here, it takes forever. Out here, we do massive concept plans really fast within about 9 months, not 14 years. So I just want to use a couple last minutes here. This is a city of Oregon City. I mean, excuse me, not Oregon City. This is the city of McMinnville. And one thing you want to see here is, unlike Oregon City, you see all these big yellow lines? That is all residential land supply within their urban growth boundary, which is one of the reasons why we go there, is because we were able to pick up and buy this corner up here, which is 136 acres, which we're going to put about 490 residential units on, single family detached, as well as 170 apartments. And some of these rural communities are very proactive in saying, yes, we want housing, we want to be able to accommodate housing and where we go. And so what that allows us to do is come in here, and we have what we call Baker Creek South, we have the east, the west, we incorporate a very large public park, and then we have all this north we're going in for now. But what we strive to do is put a variety of housing in each of our projects. Over here you'll see lots along the golf course. You'll see the medium-sized lots, and it's a mix of various lots that'll accommodate 50-foot building footprints. Then over here's what I wanted to get to, is you have these small lots to meet the minimum density requirements. Those are 32-foot wide and 40-foot wide lots, alternated in between, and 32-foot wide have a 3-foot setback, 40-foot have a 5-foot setback, so you have 8 feet between homes. But you're able to provide that to these communities at a very affordable price point, as well as apartments. So we have apartments, small, medium, and large, all in one project. All right, thank you.
Wow. I understand this is a Herculean task that we have asked these panelists to do. To try to touch on their expertise in 5 minutes is close to impossible, but I think we're all doing an outstanding job there. But we can do all the planning we want and all the home building we know. Oh, we didn't bring any construction people in to this particular conversation, which is something else. But what we did do is realize that you can build all the houses you want, but until you get a realtor who can sign it and ink a deal, you really haven't accomplished anything. And to that end, we brought a broker with Coldwell Banker Bain to talk with us. Susan Perry, very active in our chamber as well. Talk to us about the housing market from a realtor's perspective, Susan.
Well, good afternoon. So the housing section or the market is a really important area of our economy, because not only does it provide shelter and ownership, but it also employs a lot of people through the years. So builders, architects, roofers. I mean, so when the housing market isn't great, the economy isn't great. So that's the opening. And now I know this looks a little weird, but it seems like we don't have enough homes for sale. The inventory is very low, so I've kind of said that it's kind of endangered. We'd like to get it back to a normal market. I don't know if that will happen in the next few years, but with the population decreasing, there may be a possibility for that. Locally, in the Portland metro area, and these statistics are from the RMLS, this is for June of 2018, our inventory was 2.1, which means that if no homes came on the market today, that the homes on the market would be sold in 2.1 months. That's low. A normal market is 6 to 7 months, our inventory. In June 2016, it was 1.5. In June of 2017, it was 1.6. And in December of 2016, it was 1.2. There's always a slowdown in November, December for housing, and the calculations there, the way they get that is the active listings divided by the closed sale and the specific months that you're asking for. 2.1 is low. We're looking for inventory, which everybody's trying to bring up. Now, I've got Oregon City market report here. This is not exactly true. This is for Area 146, which is an area that RMLS classifies, which includes Oregon City, Canby, Molalla, Beaver Creek, and anywhere in between. So the active listings for June were 310, and the new listings were 245. Pending sales, 182 homes. Closed sales, I think it's 168. What's the average sales price is $434,100 for this area. And in 2017, it was $402,000. So you can see from 2017 to 2018, it's gone up quite a bit, the average sales price. What's interesting is the pending sales for June went down 1.6%, whereas last year in June, they had gone up 7.8%. The average days on the market for this area is 42. Last year was 38. There are other areas in the Portland metro area that are 28 days. So ours are a little bit higher out here. So let me forward. So we kind of have a circle of housing, which I call a circle of life, circle of housing. We have the millennials who have had a really tough time trying to buy homes. They came out of college, couldn't find jobs, weren't able to find homes and or first-time buyers. So they are now starting to, because of the job market, they are employed, they're buying their first houses, and some of them, because they're in their 30s, 32 to 37, they're buying houses they think that's going to be their end-all house forever. The other problem that we have right now is moving up. People who have been in their homes that bought a 2-bedroom, 1-bath home, and they were just a couple now, maybe have 2 or 3 children, they want to move up. They're having a difficult time finding those homes to move up. So the subdivisions that are being built that are $350,000 to $400,000 homes are the ones that these people will be looking forward to moving into. Then we have the baby boomers, and the big thing about them is, are they going to move out of their homes? They don't like to move out because they don't have a place to move to. Same with the people that are trying to move up. They have to make decisions. You know, are we going to downsize? Are we going to just sell our house and move on and travel? Or are we going to rent? And then the baby boomers, if they're downsizing, then they're going to be buying the homes that the millennials had or the first-time home buyers had. So that's what we're running into a lot of is the inventory, trying to find the homes, and we are still making many offers on one home. So that has not gone away. The $300,000 to $400,000 homes are the hot ticket. Anything that's about $600,000 and over are a little bit slower. For us, growth in the first city, Oregon City, you can see it everywhere with the improvements on Main Street, Midtown, and Hilltop. People want to move here. Part of the reason that they may not move here is because the prices here have gone way up. But they like the good schools. On my street alone, there are two families that just moved in from out of the school district because of the schools. So it's a good place to live, and people want to move here, and they are moving here from outside of, or coming in from Portland. So we're just going to go into closing. Food for thought. This is a nationwide thing. Baby boomers own 32 million homes. 2 out of every 5 homes. Preceding generations, the older, own 14 million homes. In the next 10 to 20 years, these generations will be making wanted and unwanted changes. Will there be an excess of homes when that happens?
I'll say it again. Wow. I'll spell it backwards. Wow. This is a lot of information. And again, I apologize to our experts up here. who were constrained by time, but we have been getting some questions here, and I'm encouraging you to keep those questions coming in as more of the presentations, and I imagine even some of the questions might spawn some more. I'm going to try to attack these with no particular order. This looks like it's directed for Christina, perhaps. It says, how long does it take an applicant to get all necessary approvals to be ready to build?
That's a good question. Well, I'm going to give the answer if you're inside the city limits, because then I'll talk about annexation before that. So if you're inside the city limits and you come in for a pre-application conference, it generally takes about 3 weeks to process, and then you have about 6 months to turn your land use application in. Oregon cities, we are regulated by the 120-day land use rule by the state of Oregon, which means cities have to have a final city decision within 120 days. So leaving room for appeals or any planning commission approvals. A subdivision, we generally as a staff like to get it out about day 60 after we see public comments. At that time, there'll be a list of conditions. Those mostly relate to infrastructure improvements. And the applicant then works with our public works department to move forward with the construction permits for infrastructure. After the infrastructure is inspected, the plat is ready to be platted, which then allows you to sell the lots and build the homes. And so depending on when you start, what time of year, and how complicated your infrastructure is, it generally is about a year, a little over a year and change to get your planning approvals and then to get your infrastructure. And if you hit the seasons right, if you don't hit the seasons right, then it may be longer. Annexation in Oregon City requires going in front of the Planning Commission and the City Commission. As of last year, if there is unanimous support by the property owners wishing to be annexed, it does not need to go to the voters. If there is a request to force a property owner in, then that goes to the voters. And so the annexation process can be done concurrent with like a subdivision application, or it can be done ahead of time. So it really depends on how much you want to consolidate your application and how much you want to kind of worry about be more prudent and be a safer approach. So it's really the time or money question.
So it depends.
Yeah, it depends.
Did you want to take a hit at that, Gordon?
Yeah.
30 months.
Okay, there you go. That's what I'm looking for. An answer. While you have the mic, Gordon, there is a question for that says specifically for you. Well, it says for Gordon Root et al. I think this is supposed to be should. Should concept planning mitigate for the NIMBY effect and support a solution?
So therein lies the problem, is that when we draw a circle around any given jurisdiction and say you guys only need to build in here, that's the only place you can build, you can't build outside, because outside, of course, we're protected for all that we love about Oregon. And you know, it should be a public engagement process driven harder by the jurisdiction with the end objective, and that is that when you submit a land use application, that's a lot of this 30 months I talked about, you have a lot of studies and traffic studies and geotechs and engineering and everything else prior to submitting the application. And part of this concept planning, I mean, it just gets in the way. I don't know how come it takes so long, but it's public process after public process. We've been doing this in the Basalt Creek planning area, and I went to a Tualatin City Council meeting last night. I'm telling you what, I've been to about 60 meetings on this over 14 years. And this property was brought in 2004 in order to meet a 20-year buildable land inventory. We're 14 years into it, 30 months away from hammering the first nail. So we're 18 years into a 20-year buildable land supply. That means something's broken. The same thing has happened here in Oregon City. I know Park Place Village has gone around and around, been approved concept plan, and then the voter approved annexation, that's finally gone to add some sanity to the process. But to an anti-growth contingent, a delay is a win, and they're very good at the delay because of too much public process.
Okay, well, tell us how you really feel about that. We understand that there are a lot of difficulties with the system. Let me toss one here to Charles, if I could, please. Charles, you have a microphone? This says, will the younger, more diverse age cohorts in our workforce that will likely change jobs more frequently approach the own versus rent housing decision differently than in the past, and how might this impact housing growth?
Yeah, that's interesting because, as we know, people older than me often would get a job and stay there 40 years, and I'm almost in that category myself. And a lot of much younger people are moving on or changing jobs. That might make it kind of difficult to buy that house and live there 40 years if you're moving, and that may have a lot to do. I mean, the affordability is an issue for young people to buy a home, but there's also some choice involved. You know, people may not want to root down if they know that they're going to have to move. So that's, and I think it's kind of a multi-part question. There was something in there about
How might it impact housing growth?
growth. Well, we all still need a place to live unless we're doubling up. So I don't think it'll impact the overall demand for housing, but it might impact the demand for types of housing.
Okay, thank you. That's a good perspective. I have a couple for Christina here. This is to
Well, you know, the answer is it depends.
to Christina. If a property owner in the city wants to develop their land, but the sewer and water lines are 500 feet away, does the city provide for the cessation of creation of a reimbursement district whereby the owner of the land paying for the utility extension gets reimbursed if other property owners use that sewer and water live later to develop their land? 25 words or less.
We have the ability to allow local improvement districts and reimbursement, and we've had some developers do that. It's usually you need to have kind of confidence that people are going to come in a timely manner. The details, I can speak to anybody who wants to do that, but it's not often used, but it can be used.
Okay. And another one for you, I think, is Oregon City property owners and developers have struggled for a couple of decades to increase the supply of residential land. The legal business by opposition the legal barriers by opposition are very low, allowing appeals by opposition for only a few $100, but costing developers many thousands. Since July 2015, the median list price of homes has risen from $400,000 to $500,000. Is anyone working to bring balance to the appeal and approval process? Loaded question.
That is a loaded question. I'm going to speak to the development aspect of an appeal of a Type 2 staff decision. That is kind of a statute by the state that those appeals be $250. Can you speak louder? Sure. Is it on? Sorry. You know, we have some regulations to appeals of administrative decisions of subdivisions of being $250. The additional aspect of has the city recouped its costs for the appeal? That's a good part of that conversation, and I know over the years our directors and our city commissioners will be looking at that.
Okay, thank you. I think this might be another one for Gordon. It says peripheral development has had a profound effect on the traffic coming through Oregon City. How can the development in Canby and Molalla help fund the infrastructure improvements required in Oregon City to accommodate growth? What do you think?
Absolutely, the development in Molalla and Canby has impacted, but the impact it's had is both on state highways. So this comes back to ODOT. We work with ODOT all the time for the highways that serve either 99 or Highway 213 and 211. All of them are tied together. But those are Oregon Department of Transportation. We work with them all the time. Obviously, the SDCs fund more local improvements and drive community development. But it's the ODOT responsibility, and that's kind of where it stops at that point. And they're more of a reactive behavior than a proactive.
Okay, thank you. I think these are going to be for Tim. says, is the 20-year supply for the UGB review going to continue to presume a high degree of apartments/density?
Okay, as I noted, we review the capacity and the forecast every 6 years. Based on the most recent, what we call an urban growth report, which includes the forecast and the capacity of the UGB, it does predict that there will be a higher level of multifamily units in the future. Yes.
Okay, thank you. I'm going to interject a question for you in the middle of this. Several years ago, Alvin Toffler came out with a book called Future Shock, and he's talking about the impacts that change have on our lives socially. And his point, I think, if I could summarize that, was not the fact that change is happening, it's the rate that it's happening. It's happening faster and faster and faster. Do you think that 6 years is an adequate time to keep reviewing those things, or should we be doing it more frequently?
Well, I guess we're required by state law to look at it every 6 years. Our council can make the decision to look at it at any time, actually, during that 6-year process, but at a minimum, we're required to look at it every 6 years. The metro jurisdiction is the only jurisdiction in the state that has that time requirement on it. Any other city does not have a time requirement to look at the growth. So we can do it at 3 years if we wanted to, or 4 years.
Okay, thank you. And this also for you, Tim, is how is this rural growth boundary affect Oregon City growth potential?
Urban growth boundary?
So it says, no, the rural growth boundary.
I'm assuming you mean the rural reserves that surround there. Well, truthfully, I think Oregon City has 5 urban reserves, I think, around the edge of it, which is probably the most if you looked at any other city in the region, Oregon City probably has the most urban reserves around it. So in terms of the city itself, it probably has quite a bit of land. Now, a lot of it is constrained by environmental slopes and, there's other constraints to it, but it does have quite a bit of land in the urban reserves compared to, say, a Beaverton that has 1 urban reserve, and actually they're looking to bring it into the urban growth boundary this year. So they wouldn't, in the future, Beaverton wouldn't even have any other future land to go into. So I think in that sense, Oregon City, if they so choose to desire to expand into that and complete the planning for it, they should be fine.
One of the questions that we hear is that we go through planning of concept plans, and then we have to struggle through the annexations and the appeals and everything, and it takes so long to get those actually built on, and yet Metro in its formulas has to calculate those as being buildable. But if they aren't being able to be built upon, doesn't it require you to change those boundaries?
Well, actually, when we do our capacity analysis, we look at the status of those areas, and we discount them based on a projection of when you think it would actually be built. A great example, which I probably hesitate to bring up, is Damascus anyways. But as you probably all know, that came into the urban growth boundary in 2002. The city formed and is no longer now. So that is land that's in the urban growth boundary still in Clackamas County. Although Happy Valley is annexing quite a bit of land in the former city of Damascus.
Oh, yes, they are.
But when we would do our capacity analysis, we discounted that about 20%, or 80% if you will. We'd only basically count 20% of that land for the next 20 years, just knowing that it was going to take a long time.
Thank you. My table is running out of room for questions here, but keep them coming. This one is for Wes. It says, what revenue does the school district receive to pay for the cost of additional students?
That's a good question. Christina told me to say depends. I resent the baby boomers on the slides, by the way, so just kind of want to point that out, Charles, when you were talking about people who are older than you, I think you were saying. Yeah. Anyway,
my age and older.
There you go. Thank you. Well, a couple of things. One is, as far as growth-related revenues, the district does assess a construction excise tax, which is so much per square foot for residential residential square footage, and then so much for square foot for commercial development, but then that's capped so that I think it's capped in the mid-20s or so per project. So if you built a really large project, you'd have a cap at that level. And we've been doing that for many years because the state does not give us any capital money directly, and so it was really up to the local district to either pass a general obligation bond or to exercise its authority to do a construction excise tax. And so we do that annually, and we receive somewhere between $300,000 and $400,000 typically from the construction excise tax, which does go a long way for us to be able to do some capital projects, which we are struggling to keep up with as we've got an aging infrastructure. As far as operating money, for us, it's not only our facility costs and so forth, but it's also how to operate our facilities, because the state's operating revenues don't come to you based upon a certain size school. They come to you based upon a certain number of students. So everybody would love to have the small neighborhood school back. We would love to build them and we'd love to operate them, but the fixed cost per student is just too high. And so you wouldn't be able to have the services that you would need in a school if you had a really small school. So hence why around the Portland metro area, you'll see the school sizes going up, not down. And that's mostly because of fixed operating costs.
And some economy of scale?
Yeah, there's some economy of scale there to a certain extent, but there are tipping points within that scale. So the idea is find that community-based place that's comfortable and affordable and allows you to operate the program for a full school calendar. So, and then the state does have a state bond matching program, which is recently new, and we actually, it's a not super complex, but we have qualified this year so that if we do pass our general obligation bond here in November, we will get somewhere between about $4 to $8 million in state money. So
In addition to whatever the bond.
in addition to the bond proceeds.
Sweet. I have 3 questions here that really are going to be more appropriate to next month's, but I'll toss them out here in case somebody just wants to make a comment about them. It says, as a business owner, I'm concerned about the shrinking supply of ready-to-go industrial land and affordable housing for my growing workforce, which is really next month. What is Oregon City and Metro doing to address these issues for local businesses? Don't have to answer that right now. Clackamas County Community College enrollment is close to 30,000 students. How can Oregon City recruit these millennials to live, work, and stay in their city? Really has to do with employment and business, which will be next month. Question for the audience. I'll get to that in a second too. To Tim. Under Metro's rules, the UGB has periodic reviews every 3 years for an expansion up to 1,000 acres. Right now, all UGB expansions can only go into urban reserves. Is Clackamas County's urban reserve map adopted?
There's a few questions in there. Yes, there is. As I mentioned before, we're required to look at it every 6 years. Just last year, the legislature passed a law that provided us a different, a 3-year option to review the urban growth boundary. Only for residential purposes, it would be capped for 1,000 acres. And what it means is that we don't have to do the urban growth report. We don't have to do a new forecast or a new capacity analysis. We can depend on the one we're completing this year. So if there were some cities who wanted to expand into the urban reserve in 2021, and they completed the concept planning for it and met some other code factors we could expand the UGB for them at that time, but it's capped on 1,000 acres. The one other nice thing about that process, that we're calling it the mid-cycle process, is for this current one, the legislative process, we have to evaluate all 32 urban reserve areas and do a comparative analysis of it, and it's a very long, drawn-out process. For the mid-cycle one, we would not have to do that. It would just be For instance, just say, not that Oregon City is going to, but if they wanted to, they could complete the concept planning for an area, submit it to Metro for consideration for expansion of the UGB. I think one was, yes, expansion would have to go into an urban reserve. That's the first priority under the state hierarchy. That was that one slide that I had. So that's where we have to look first. If you cannot meet the need that we're searching for in an urban reserve, there is potential to go into some undesignated land. That's not. What was the third one?
Is Clackamas County's urban reserve map adopted?
Yes, good question. I was talking to Gordon about this earlier. It's kind of some legal terms, I guess you might say, on this. Depends, yeah. Depends how you look at it, I guess. Metro and Clackamas County adopted the urban and rural reserves in Clackamas County. They submitted to the state for approval. The state approved it, both verbally and the written acknowledgement. Then there's a 21-day appeal period. It has been appealed. So it was appealed by property owners south of the Willamette River along I-5. It has a rural reserve designation, does not want that. So then that will get appealed back to the Court of Appeals. The expectation is the court will have a hearing on that in November of this year. And we just had a meeting the other day with DLCD staff, Department of Land Conservation Development staff. We meet with them quarterly. And that was part of one of the topics. And it was guessing on when the determination would come out of the Court of Appeals. It ranged anywhere from 8 to 14 months. So it's hard to say exactly when.
Got it. Thank you very much. And thanks for defining what LUBA means, for those that don't know. And Susan, you were mentioning the RMLS. What is RMLS?
Oh, Regional Multiple Listing Service. That's
Regional Multiple Listing Service.
Is this on? That's what the realtors use, to wake you up, to input their listings in. If you can pull up rmls.com and look at the houses that are for sale and pending. Companies like Zillow and Redfin, they pull from RMLS and get their information from RMLS. National Association of Realtors, Realtor.com also gets them from our local RMLS. RMLS is really the place to get the information if you know how to navigate it.
And Susan, you talked about having a very low inventory at 2.1 months right now, and that's not good if you're trying to sell properties. No. If you're trying to buy properties, is that?
It's great if you're trying to sell properties.
The other way around, yeah.
It's not very good if you're trying to buy property. Because
So
you have multiple.
What would be an ideal inventory?
6 to 7. So if you get above 7, then you're getting into a buyer's market. And we've had that also a few years ago. But we have been in the 2s and the 1s for the last 4 or 5 years. And for buyers, especially first-time buyers, it's very difficult sometimes to buy a home. They can place 4 or 5 offers and not have any of them accepted. So when you call them the 4th time and tell them their offer, which is their best offer ever, they've gotten money from family to help them, they've gone as high as they can, and they still don't get it, it's hard to call them the 4th and 5th time to let them know.
Let me see, I have a couple more questions here. How are we doing on time? It's 10 till. And I'm willing to stay a little later, but I know that a lot of you have to be out of here exactly at 1 o'clock, so I will try to respect that. This is an interesting one. It says, Portland has encouraged the building of ADUs, that's auxiliary dwelling, or accessory dwelling units, ADUs. But once completed, the taxes were raised exponentially. Are there favorable property tax considerations for ADUs in Oregon City / Clackamas County? Anybody want to take a bite at that?
No. So I do not work for Clackamas County, and I can't speak for them. For Oregon City, you also have to pay systems development fees, and that's tagged as the price of a unit in a multifamily development. I know in the issue related to Multnomah County, it was related to reassessing the full value of the house. So kind of the the 3% cap on assessment was kind of reanalyzed. They weren't just adding the new value of the ADU, they were going to look back on the value of the house. So that got a little bit of the exponential increase, which I don't believe Clackamas County had that practice. But I do know Multnomah County has a specific reason for some of that. But when you add an accessory dwelling unit, there are extra fees, both in taxes and system development fees.
And so Oregon City is now encouraging these ADUs. The new code will be even more so. And we're just wondering if is that something that the city can control? The city isn't controlling the taxes though, right?
No, that's Clackamas County.
Assessed value.
So as part of this equitable housing strategy, it was a code audit. So we looked at the slide I showed. We were looking at ways to increase that ability for that missing middle to be in our single-family residential districts and to apply more options. Some of our next steps are to look at things like system development fees. So that is a future project of our city commission, but really wasn't part of this code audit.
Thank you. Boy, I've got 4 questions here. Let's see how quick we can get through these things. This is open to everybody, but semantics perhaps. What is your definition of equitable housing? And nobody wants to take that. So you're going to take that, Gordon.
You know, equitable housing is interesting and comes back to, I always call it the ABCs of housing: affordability, balance, and choice. And, you know, there's these goals, these statewide land use planning goals, and one of them talks about diversity of housing. And the automatic default is that means you have to build small attainable units. So instead of affordable, we call them attainable. You know, what is attainable? It's something different for each person sitting in the room. But you do need to have a diversity of housing, and equitable housing distribution means that even the senior level executive or business owner needs to be able to have a place that they want to call home within the urban growth boundary, and that may be on an acre lot that is a McMansion. But you need those people to want to live nearby so they can build on the available industrial land supply, so they can provide the jobs to the people that can afford various other levels of housing can be there as well. So it is a broad spectrum, and we can't ignore the top end of the market, which that people tend to want to do with the code, and just focus on the affordable. And now the affordable, yes, it has to be there, and yes, we've gone to small lot detached, and you know the market will drive that, like driving people out. But the middle, I think, is, you know, we just have to deal with smaller setbacks and smaller lots, more efficient use of land.
Okay, thank you.
William, can I pop in for a second?
Sure.
When we were working with our advisory committee for the equitable housing, what we really heard, kind of the emotion of, how can we provide enough housing choices that people can spend their whole life in Oregon City? And they don't feel that based on where they are in their lifetime, be it single, married, needed to move in with families, needed to, you know, be able to support other family members, that they have a place they can live. And that we don't want to ever be a community that constricts our housing choices to a point where people can't live in the city they love.
Great, thank you very much. 2 more. Well, this one is a little awkward. It says question for the audience. And since we don't have mics set up in the audience, I'm not going to ask the audience to respond, except perhaps by show of hands. How many in the audience support, and there's a list of these things, higher gas taxes, VFR, or that's value, or tolls to add to the funding needed for transportation improvements? Gas taxes, VFR, or tolls?
Vehicle registration fee.
Right.
Are we supposed to choose them?
Okay, so we have one hand up. Okay, there's one person that says that they would support either gas taxes, VFR, or tolls to add to the funding needed for transportation improvements. Well, we have 2 hands up.
Oh, so all of those would go towards that last part, because you didn't say what the tax was gonna go for, so my hand's not going up.
Add to the funding needed for transportation improvements. If unsupporting, then how should the state and local government pay? Don't answer right now. So if you have some ideas, I'm sure that the state and local government would love to hear about that. Here's to all panel members, and then we have one last fun question. Do you view UGB as a positive or negative requirement Part 2, if the answer is negative, how do you propose keeping urban sprawl from happening if we didn't have a UGB? Does anybody
Of course, I'll pick that up. You know, many years ago, I had this campaign going and support a reasonable expansion of the urban growth boundary. So the urban growth boundary is great in concept, and if you go back to Senate Bill 100 in 1970, with this 20-year buildable land supply and a concentric expansion of the urban growth boundary, it's a great concept. It's just that there's too much resistance against it. The rural reserves are locked up tight right next to it for 35 to 50 years. Tim was talking to me about it's a 50-year deal. Everything green on that map you can't touch for 50 years. So that means inside there is going to be more dense, more dense, more dense. So I think if it was to work as it was planned, yes, or you can let the free market dictate, and most people are going to want to live near urban centers where the jobs are, and it would bring affordability right into line.
Okay. And another opinion?
I don't know if this is on or not.
Try that up. Try the one next to there.
I think it's a good idea. I think if you look at what we've accomplished with the whole point of the urban growth boundary was, to protect farm and forest land. That was the direction that the state passed, and we've done that. We all benefit from having that nearby rural land to us for agricultural products, farm. We all appreciate when we leave the urban growth boundary and we're heading to the coast, all of a sudden, wow, we're out of the city and we're in a beautiful landscape. I think we all appreciate that, and that's why people actually move here. Fly to Chicago and you see a very different pattern of hopscotch growth all over the place. Housing prices is not, it's very expensive to build housing. It's not all just land supply. It definitely is a component of it, but infrastructure is a huge component of it. And the federal government and other places aren't spending or paying for sanitary sewer and water and roads and stuff like they used to. So it's falling back onto the local governments and the developers to do that. So it's very expensive to build in these areas. But I think it's been a real benefit to the region as a whole. And that land supply is going to say the rural reserves based on state law are set for 50 years. What that means is the existing zoning can't change for 50 years. So if you have potential to subdivide your property, you can do that, if your zoning allowed it at that time. It's just you can't urbanize it, you can't intensify the use of the property.
And in 50 years, perhaps attitudes will change. In 50 years, perhaps attitudes will change and higher density will be more acceptable.
Also the Metro and the 3 counties agreed to review the urban and rural reserves after 20 years, and we're truthfully about 8 years into that already. So they would look at that, and as Gordon and I were talking about earlier, that's what's currently in state law, and things do change, as we all know.
Yes, back to our little potted plant there. Yes, change. So. There was one last fun question about autonomous vehicles, AVs, and how that's going to interact with our impacted growth in Oregon City, which I think is a really fascinating question, but it's probably not appropriate, nor do we have the time to explore autonomous vehicles right now. Where's Kent? There he is. Well, wake up. And if you'd like to wrap this up, I would like to ask for a big round of applause for our panelists who really put the heat.
Yeah, that was amazing, really, truly amazing. I was kind of looking around the room at people's faces, and everybody was totally engaged with what you were sharing. So Charles, Tim, Wes, Christina, Gordon, Susan, I appreciate it. On behalf of the Oregon City Business Alliance, we truly appreciate everything that you provided us with today. And since there will be a quiz at next month's forum on business growth, be sure to bring all your notes that you took during the presentation.